students, welcome to the massive open online course on money and financial market. In today's module, we are going to talk about the demand for money. Essentially, this is the second part of demand for money. In our previous lecture, we also talked about demand for money, but there are certain things that we could not cover in our previous lecture. These are the things that we will try to cover in today's analysis. Very briefly, the prime objective of today's lecture is to acquaint you with these things. What are the things? The number one is the Keynesian approach to the problem of demand for money. In our previous analysis, we talked about the classical approach, and I mentioned that there are other approaches. Keynesian approach is one of them, and it is perhaps the most important one. So this is the objective number one of today's lecture. Objective number two is to also look at the demand for money from another perspective, which is called Friedman's idea of demand for money, which is also known as the monetarist approach or post-Keynesian approach. And of course, at the end of this lecture, this is of course the third objective of today's lecture, to acquaint you the information with the information of what is the messages that you can take from this lecture. So in the backdrop of these three objectives, let me very quickly move to the first one, the Keynesian idea of the demand for money. If we very quickly remember that in classical idea of demand for money, we assumed that demand for money depends on income. But what are the different motives for which a consumer, a person actually is willing to demand some money? According to Keynes, these motives are of three types. One motive is the transaction motive, motive number two is the precautionary motive, and motive number three is the speculative motive. Transaction motive talks about the amount of money that the people want to hold that is essentially positively related with his income. If we remember that the consumption function of macroeconomics, we know that as the money income goes up, the people usually try to consume more. So here also the same thing is happening, that when the money income goes up, the people want to have more money for the transaction purposes. So it is expected at the same time that the money demand is directly related with the income, but on the other hand, the money demand or the transaction demand for money also depends on something else other than income, which is called rate of interest. The relationship between rate of interest and the money demand is negative. This comes under the transaction motive. So when interest rate rises, people hold less money. When interest rate falls, people hold more money. And it doesn't require much more qualification, because we know when interest rate rises, people want to keep money in the bank. So they don't want much more money to be in their hand. In that case, what is going to happen, if you remember the previous class, that in that case, the velocity of money is going to go up. The next one is the precautionary motive. Precautionary motive is essentially, as we know from the word precaution, is that safety motive. Safety motive means in case of any uncertainty, people also want to have some money in their pockets. So that is why it is also a sort of thing that is for transaction purpose, but the point is that this transaction is not very certain. I'm not very certain about some issues of my life, but for that purpose, I also want to hold some money. So this is called precautionary motive. But if we look at these two things very carefully, we can easily say that transaction motive and the precautionary motive are essentially almost in the same line. One covers the certain demand, the other covers the uncertain demand. One is expected transaction demand, precautionary demand is unexpected. And then we move to the speculative motive. Students, please remember that in Cambridge economics or Cambridge approach, they implicitly assume that the interest rate has a role to play in money demand function, but they didn't include this interest rate or the role of interest rate in the money demand function. Keynes did this thing. Keynes introduced the idea how interest rate is affecting the demand for money. In fact, money is held actually in anticipation of something. So, if interest rate is very high today, people expect that the interest rate will go down. Then, what are the alternatives that the people have? If the interest rate goes down or if the interest rate goes up, people may have alternative for bond price. So there is a relationship between interest rate and bond price. This relationship is inverse and negative. I will come to that issue in few minutes. Then you will get to know why this relationship is negative. So the additional demand for money exists because of the uncertainty about future interest rate and the relationship between changes in the interest rate and the price of bonds. So Keynes divided assets into two broad categories. One is money, the other is bond. But again, one thing should be noted that Keynes actually categorized all these uncertain assets as bond. So it may have some other equities, shares, demand deposit, etc. But Keynes coined them as bond. Now, as I mentioned that the speculative motive, where the expected return of a certain amount of money, it should be zero. Expected return means on an average, the income that may be generated or the satisfaction that may be generated from income. But at the same time, I know that if I go for bond buying, this bond is likely to give me some positive benefit. If that happens, then expected return should be zero if and only if I have some negative return when I keep some money with me and I'm not investing this money for some investment or productive purpose. So transaction demand is giving me some sort of negative benefit, whereas the speculative demand for money is giving me some sort of positive benefit. And as a whole, the whole thing is boiling down to zero. So the bottom line here is that if people expect interest rates to increase in future, it is very apparent and one can easily understand. If I expect the interest rate to rise in future, the expected rate of return on bonds would be less than the current yield. What is that? The idea, very briefly, let me tell you, that if the interest rate is very high today, then I expect that the interest rate will go down tomorrow. If the interest rate goes down tomorrow, then as a rational consumer, I'm not going to put this money in the bank where bank is going to give me some interest rate because interest rate is low now. So if that happens, then I will search for some alternative avenue where I can invest my money, where I can put my money. So what are the alternatives that I have? Instead of putting my money in the bank, I keep this money aside so that I can buy some bond. So that in future, I can sell this bond and I can earn more money. So when I expect the interest rate to go down in future, mind it, when interest rate is very high today, I'm expecting this interest rate to go down in future. When interest rate goes down in future, I'm withdrawing some money from that bank and keeping it free so that I can buy this bond. So I'm buying this bond, so demand for bond is increasing. So when interest rate is expected to fall, the demand for bond is expected to rise. Therefore, naturally, the bond price should rise. So the relationship between bond price and interest rate is absolutely negative. This thing must be remembered throughout this course of money and financial market. Because if one confuses between these two things, the understanding of a whole process will be faulty. So students, be careful and remember it throughout. So here we have another example so that you can find this thing, because another term which is associated with the bond price and the gain that is associated with bond, which is known as capital gain or capital loss. Again, I am putting forward an example that I am buying a bond of say rupees 1000, and the government decides that if I sell this bond in 2 years down the line, I'm going to get rupees 50 as the return. So this rupees 50 is called the coupon payment. You can see in the slide that this coupon payment is fixed. Mind it, this coupon payment is calculated on the basis of the current interest rate. So if, consider case number 1, if the interest rate goes down, say when I'm investing rupees 1,000 on bond and I'm expecting rupees 50 as the coupon payment, then the interest rate should ideally be 5%. Now, if the interest rate goes down to 2% and I'm expecting it to go down to 2% in 2 years down the line, then the coupon payment 50, which is fixed. So to earn 50 from certain amount of money must increase, because initially or previously rupees 1,000 gave me rupees 50 when interest rate was 5%. But now interest rate is 2%. So to get rupees 50 as the return, I must invest more than 1,000. So the bond whose price was 1,000 2 years ago must increase from 1,000. So when the interest rate goes down from 5% to 2%, to get 50 rupees 50 as the coupon payment, the bond price must have to be 2,500. So the same bond that I purchased at rupees 1,000 is now being sold in the market at rupees 2,500. So the same bond is yielding me 1,500 gain. So this is what we know as capital gain. Students, be very careful in calculating this capital gain. And when the interest rate goes up from 5% to 10%, I am not going to get this capital gain. Instead, what I am going to get is capital loss. So this rate of interest, bond price, and capital loss or capital gain, all these things are interlinked, and these things actually forms the basis of speculative demand for money. So in the relative desirability of money and bonds and the expected return on these two assets can be expressed as follows. What is that? The return on money, as you know, it is 0. But the expected return on bonds, it has two components. One is interest earning, the other is expected capital gain. Interest earning means the interest payment that I can earn at this point of time. And the expected capital gain means what I'm expecting if I sell this bond or if I buy bond in future. There may be a possibility of gain and loss. The whole thing, if we add all these things together, it should be equal to 0. As I said, the expected return on money is ideally 0. Now, in this backdrop, I need to draw a very interesting curve. The curve is that the economy consists of a large number of population, like me, like you, like a person X, person Y. So first of all, we'll try to look at the individual behavior or reaction depending on rate of interest. And then if we sum them together, we can get the aggregate speculative demand for holding money for the economy as a whole. So there are two types of return on bond, as I slightly mentioned in my previous slide. So one is the interest payment, which is the current income. So if I buy this thing, if I put money in the bank, I'll get this interest. And the other is expected capital gain. So what I said is that if my interest rate is somewhere in between Rn and Rc. What is Rc? I'll come to that. Rc is essentially critical rate of interest. So if my interest rate is above this critical rate of interest, now you can ask me, how can I calculate this critical rate of interest? This critical rate of interest is determined by a lot of other issues which are not taken into account in this lecture, because this is slightly complicated issue and it is also depending on some institutional factors like central bank, other commercial banks, the government policies, etc. But we can assume that RC is fixed somewhere. If I assume now, if the rate of interest is higher than RC, what is going to happen? I'm expecting that the interest rate will fall. If the interest rate falls, then the bond price should increase. If that happens, then the speculative demand for money should not be more. In fact, if the interest rate is very high, people are not willing to buy bond. people are not willing to do anything with money. Rather, it is better for the people to go for putting this money in the bank. So the speculative demand for money remains almost zero for the interest rate when it is higher than RC. RN is one such interest rate. Any interest rate above RN also gives me this kind of thing. And when interest rate is exactly equal to RC, then what is going to happen? People are essentially indifferent between speculative demand for money and other forms of money. So that is why at the level of RC, I may have a discontinuous segment. But below RC, I am just going to get a completely reverse thing what I said before. When interest rate goes down, people are reluctant to put money in the bank. Instead of putting money in the bank, people will put money for the purpose of speculation, for the purpose of buying bond. So speculative demand for money will just jump, and there is a jump cut, and it will go up to the level of M2. So I have three things. One is, when rate of interest is higher than RC, my speculative demand for money is zero. When my rate of interest is exactly equal to critical rate of interest, I'm indifferent between speculative demand for money and transaction demand for money. And when interest rate is less than critical rate of interest, my speculative demand for money is maximum. So the relationship between rate of interest and the speculative demand for money, as students you can follow from these arguments that it is negative. So if we collect all this information and go for aggregating the speculative demand for holding money, what I'm going to get is that at the extreme rate of interest, very high or very low, people behave, in a more consensus way. This is the general idea that when rate of interest is very high, speculative demand for money falls for everyone in the economy. When rate of interest goes down, the speculative demand for money goes up almost for all the people in the economy. But the interesting part is that if the interest rate reaches the level R0, then people do not expect much to happen in the bond market. And this interest rate is essentially called interest rate where a trap is formed. This trap is called liquidity trap. This liquidity trap means the very low rate of interest, all investors would expect that the interest rate to rise substantially in the future. At this rate, there is a general expectation of capital loss, what I explained before. When rate of interest is very low, the possibility of capital loss is very high. So, after reaching this interest rate, speculative demand for money will increase infinitely and it becomes horizontal. This implies that it is infinite. So once it is horizontal, nothing is going to happen on the vertical axis. Whatever happens to the horizontal axis, the money supply or speculative demand for money may go up, but interest rate will not change, as if the interest rate is trapped at this level. That is why at this trap is being done by the liquidity preference of the people of the economy as a whole. So that is why it is called liquidity trap. This liquidity trap idea, a liquidity trap concept, is one of the most fascinating concepts of macroeconomics, and it is propounded by John Maynard Keynes. So, speculative demand for money schedule becomes nearly horizontal here. So, if we add all these motives together, the function for money demand following John Maynard Keynes can be written as the following equation. The equation says that MD, money demand, is equal to L of Y and R, where Y stands for income and R stands for rate of interest. As I mentioned before, that the money income goes up, the demand for transaction actually increases, and when rate of interest goes up, the demand for transaction purpose also goes down. And this is also consistent with the idea of speculation. So in equational form or in linear form, I may also write the money demand function following Keynes as follows. And it is written as MD is equal to, students look at this equation very carefully, it is C0 or C0 plus C1Y minus C2Y. I'm telling you again, one is plus, the other is minus. The plus C1 signifies the positive relationship between Y and M, whereas minus sign for C2 signifies the negative relationship between rate of interest and the money demand function. And the parameter C1 gives the increase in money demand per unit increase in income, whereas C2 gives us the amount by which money demand declines per unit increase in the rate of interest. So this is essentially the Keynesian idea of demand for money. Now what happens after Keynes said that this should be the equation for the demand for money? But that's not the end. Then comes post-Keynesian or the monetarist view. The monetarist view is Friedman's concept of demand for money. Friedman's concept of demand for money actually is a kind of attack on Keynes. Keynes attacked the classical economists, and then post-Keynesian, the monetarists, they attacked Keynesian view. Attack means not a very aggressive attack, it's intellectual attack. So Friedman was the pioneer of this school, and he said that just we need to modify the Cambridge version of quantity theory of money. In our previous lecture, we said that Cambridge version of the quantity theory of money may have two forms. One is the income version, the other is the transaction version. But the Cambridge version says that it is essentially depending on the money income. But if Friedman tried to introduce or incorporate the Keynesian viewpoint of rate of interest and the money demand, and then tried to put in the idea of Keynes into the Cambridge equation. And then what he got is the money demand function is essentially K bar Py. And bar, when it is bar, means it is fixed or it is constant. So if you look at this equation very carefully, and if you remember our previous lecture, that we also had MB is equal to Py, MB is equal to 1 by KPy. All these things are almost similar. And here this K also takes care of the problem of rate of interest that was introduced by Keynes. So Friedman actually, Friedman came up with the hybrid of Cambridge version and the Keynesian version. So that is the latest one, where money supply is denoted by M, money demand is denoted by MD, and which should ideally be equal to K bar Py. So I'm not going to elaborate much on this thing. Here, what Friedman said that rate of interest is not only associated with bond, as it is done by Keynes, but Friedman said we may have bond, we may have equity, we may have demand deposit. But as a whole, these are not going to have a very significant effect on the rate of interest, so we can club them together. But the main point of interest is that Krugman tried to find what determines this K. And eventually what he got is that K is essentially turns out to be almost a constant kind of thing. Then what are the distinguishing features of Friedman's quantity theory of money? Because we got to know the Cambridge version, we already have an idea about the Keynesian version, and now we have Friedman's version. The Friedman's quantity theory of money has some distinguishing feature. The number one, the demand for money is stable, which is unlike the Keynesian system. In Keynesian system, it depends on whole lot of other issues. But Friedman said that no, demand for money is more or less stable in the economy. And the demand function plays an important role in determining the economic activity of any country. And the quantity of money is strongly affected by money supply. So it is not that the demand for money in isolation can determine something. Money supply, money demand, and the equilibrium proposition or the equilibrium point, equilibrium condition, all together helps determining the price level, the velocity of money, and the fraction of money that we want to have, or K bar, etc. And changes in quantity of money are important in determining the nominal income of the economy. So at the end, what are the basic messages that I have from this demand for money 2 lecture? Number one, according to the classical quantity theory which has been developed by Fisher and the Cambridge economist, nominal income is determined primarily by the quantity of money. And Keynes attacked this view. And Keynes came up with the idea that there is a constant velocity of money and argued that the velocity is affected by the behavioral economic variables and most importantly by the nominal rate of interest that constitutes the speculative demand. And then Keynes concluded that the demand for money is negatively related to the nominal rate of interest, which is a significant contribution and departure from the classical quantity theory of money. And Keynes also got the idea of liquidity trap. And then comes Friedman. Friedman argued that the demand for money depends on permanent income and the incentive for holding other assets relative to money. So instead of money, I can have some money investing in other purposes. So in contrast to Keynes, Friedman said that the demand for money is stable and insensitive to interest rate because we may have different alternative baskets. So as a whole, this gives me some sort of constancy there. So this implied that the velocity of money in the economy as a whole is very much predictable, and it yields that the quantity theory conclusion that money is the primary determinant of nominal aggregate spending. So with this note, I can say that almost these are the theories or these are the versions that can be used to analyze the demand for money, and we have covered all these things in our 2 lectures. Thank you very much.